My name is Stuart Carlton, and we are going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. Thank you so much for attending it. We'll be presenting some work that I did when I was a postdoc at Purdue University, and I'm really excited about it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. Let me turn off my pretty picture and turn on the slideshow. Thank you. Okay, great. I think this means the slideshow is going, which means I think it's time to start recording if you are recording it. So the title of today's show, or webinar, is Do Extreme Events Cause a Shift in Climate Change Beliefs? A Study of the 2000 Midwestern U.S. Drought and Agriculture. And this is work I did while I was at Purdue University in the Natural Resources Social Science Lab as part of the Useful to Usable project. And I led up this part of it, but the whole thing is we see all the co-authors I have here, and they're just as responsible as I am, especially for the bad parts. So I'd like to acknowledge them right away. And I would also like to acknowledge a number of organizations that have helped to pay for this. Again, there's UTU, which is a large agriculture product and climate change project that I was a part of, and I'll talk about that a little more later. There's also the USDA, which funded part of the work, and NOAA, and NIDIS, who is providing us with the technology and time for this webinar. And then I'd also like to thank Texas Sea Grant, which is where I work now. They didn't fund any of the work, but they have allowed me to work on this webinar and do it while I work here, and even though it's neither Texas nor sea. So thank you to that. Now we're going to start with a little bit of navel gazing, some sort of meta webinar stuff that I want to touch on first before we get going. And so the first thing is, I'm not telling you because it's not going. There we go. The first thing is, this isn't ancient Greece, right? I'm not Socrates or an oracle up here. We would prefer to have an interaction than a lecture, at least to a certain extent. And so feel free to speak up. But there will be question breaks. But if you have a really pressing question, you can go ahead and ask it. Or there will be at least 2 or 3 question breaks, because I know that I can't listen to somebody bloviate for more than a couple minutes, and I suspect that you can't either. So feel free to go ahead and interrupt if you think it's necessary. Now, on top of that, there is a little chat box, I believe. I actually can't see the chat box, but it is being manned and womaned by people who know just as much about this research as I do. So feel free to chime in on the chat box, but know that I will not see it, but there are some knowledgeable folks there. And there's also the question thing. I believe, though I do not know, that I can see the questions that you ask in the question box. So if you ask that, it may or may not come to me, and if it does, then I'll answer it, assuming that it's a good question. If it's a bad question, then I suggest not asking it. On the off chance that there are any unanswered questions, you can always send me an email after. There's my email address now at Texas A&M, and the U2U, that's Useful to Usable project website, is right there at your www.agclimate4u, that's a numeral 4 and a letter u.org, and that's the U2U project site where you can find out all the stuff that they're doing and who to contact. And now one last thing is, this is a diverse group, so let's all get on the same page. Because I looked at the attendee list, and we have sociologists on here and honorary sociologists. We have climate modelers. We have people who know a lot about ag. We have people who don't know a lot about ag. We have my mom, I think, might be on. And so I just want to make sure that we're all starting off from a certain base of knowledge. And so to that extent, we're going to give you 3 things that social science teaches us about climate change in the American public. All right, so I want to start with these 3 pieces of information, or these 3 pieces of knowledge that we think are true based on social science research. The first one is that people still lag behind scientists in climate change belief. And a lot of this work has been done by Anthony, or Tony, I believe he goes by, Leiserowitz at Yale, project on climate change communication, and a lot of this work was done at George Mason too. And they do a big survey every year, every couple of years, called Climate Change in the American Mind. Or the 6 Americas survey is the other big one that they're known for, and that's actually the one we're going to talk about. And so let's look at the 6 Americas over time. So first of all, when they first took this measure was in 2008, and they found that about 7% of people were dismissive of climate change. They found about 11% of people were doubtful, about 12% were disengaged. So these groups here which I believe you can see, were the sort of non-believers. And these groups here are the people who either do believe or could potentially believe in the case of the cautious. And so about 33% of people were concerned. About 18% of people fit in their groups that they called alarmed. And you can go look on the website for the specific definition. But generally speaking, the redder it is, the less worried they are. The greener it is, the more worried they are. And so this was in 2008. Looking forward, they redid the survey in 2010, and the concern had gone down, the number of cautious had gone up, and the number of alarmed had gone down. This very well may be the effects of ClimateGate, actually, if you remember ClimateGate and all of those emails that were unfortunate, maybe we could say. There was an unfortunate series of emails, and so that may have eroded trust significantly. But generally speaking, though, it stayed relatively steady. In 2011, it stayed extremely steady. And then in 2012, the most recent one I had data for, it hovered around 29% of people were concerned, 16% were alarmed, 25% were cautious. And so really, when you add all that up, that's 70%, if I did that math right. And so, you know, that's not bad, right? 70% of people either have no opinion or are worried about climate change. When you hear a lot about the controversy, I mean, look at the relatively low number of people that are dismissive of the issue. It's a small minority, but it's a loud minority at times. So we're looking at 70% who you could argue at least are somewhat worried about climate change. How does this compare to scientists? Well, there's a common study that gets tossed around that about 97, 98% of climate scientists believe in climate change or an anthropogenic climate change. And we actually, Linda Prokopi, the head of the UTU project, and I and a couple other co-authors did a recent study of scientists in general. Well, let's go back. Scientists in general and their beliefs in climate change. And it turns out that basically every scientist believes in climate change. So this is the proportion of people who believe temperatures have risen on the x-axis, and then right up here is just by the different groups. And so this gray line is the mean, and the mean is up there at about 92% or so. And so well over 90% of scientists overall believe that climate change is occurring. Incidentally, the lowest group of scientists were those who are in natural resources. But even then, it's still roughly 90% believe that climate change was occurring. And so even though there's 50 to 70% of the public believe in anthropogenic or climate change, it's over 90% of scientists. And so the public is lagging behind scientists on climate change. And this is in review right now. I'm expecting an email on it any minute now. So if I squeak during the webinar, that means the paper was accepted. Now let's see. Second, lack of knowledge is not the primary problem. Okay, this is probably, if you don't know this, the most important thing you'll learn today. My research is obviously very important, the second most important thing you'll learn, but this is sort of the one message that I think social science can give people who want to communicate about climate change. And that is, people who don't believe in climate change, it's not because of a lack of knowledge. Let's look at some data about this. And so the big person doing work here, his name is Dan Kahan over at the Yale Law School of all places, and he's doing something called the Cultural Cognition Project, and he's looking into why people do or do not believe in climate change. And a couple of his results, I think, are really, really important and the most interesting and exciting social science work that's been done in climate change in recent times, again, accepting, of course, what you're learning about today. And so what Kahan did was he grouped people into a series of groups based on what he calls their cultural values. And he found that two groups of people tend to have the most extreme views on climate change. The first group is the egalitarian communitarians, and the second group is the hierarchical individualists. Now, egalitarian communitarians tend to be hippies, if you will. They believe in an egalitarian society in which the job of the community is to look after people. Hierarchical individualists tend to be Gordon Gekko types. These are extremes, obviously. But you have your Dalai Lamas and your Gordon Gekkos, I guess. And they tend to believe that society has a strict, defined hierarchy and that people should look out for themselves over the goods of many. And it turns out, though, among those people, the higher their science literacy, the more polarized they are in climate change belief. Okay, so let me talk about this again. They measured science literacy and numeracy. And those who were the most science literate among these two groups, those who were the most science literate, had the most divergent views on climate change. This axis is perceived risk. So the super educated egalitarian communitarians perceived a lot of risk, and the super educated or super literate, science literate hierarchical individualists perceived the opposite of a lot of risk, so very little risk. So it looks like you know, knowing about science isn't necessarily the issue here. Let's look at it in a different way. So here we have, this is a dot chart. How much risk do you believe global warming poses to human health, human safety, or human prosperity? And the left here is very liberal, strong Democrats. The right here is very conservative, strong Republicans. And this axis is from no risk all the way up to high risk. And look at where the clusters are. The liberal, strong Democrats and perceive much higher risk than do the Republicans. And this is a highly significant model here. And this is from a recent paper that you can find at Kahan's website. He posts all the stuff on the SSRI site. So you can go download it there. And so you note that politics is playing a huge part here, right? Or maybe not politics as much as political values. So I think this is really interesting. It's so the politics is really a big variable here. But this is something else from this paper that is mind-blowing. Let's look at this. What gas do most scientists believe causes temperatures in the atmospheres to rise? Is it hydrogen, helium, carbon dioxide, or radon? The blue people are to the left of center politically. The red people are to the right of center politically. There's no significant difference in the number that correctly selected CO2. 75% correctly selected CO2. Another question. The increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide associated with the burning of fossil fuels will reduce photosynthesis by plants. Is this true or is this false? Again, the people left of center, most of them correctly answered, incorrectly answered that it's true. And here, right of center, most of them incorrectly answered that it's true. But again, the differences aren't that great. Another question. Human-caused global warming will result in flooding of many coastal regions. Sorry about the typo there. That's Dan's, not mine. Sure, people left of center are much more likely to agree, but look at the people right of center. It's not that low, right? If North Pole ice cap melted as a result of human-caused global warming, global sea levels would rise. Again, there are differences, but not that extreme. Globally averaged sea temperatures, surface air temperatures, were higher in the first decade of the 21st century than for the last decade of the 20th century. Again, there are differences, but not that stark, and over half of the people got it right. Human-caused global warming will increase the risk of skin cancer. This is not true, and the Republicans were actually more likely to get that correct. So when people say they don't believe in climate change, they're expressing their identity, not their knowledge. Okay, this is really powerful and important to think about as background to what we're going to talk about today. When someone says, I don't believe in climate change, it is not a statement of knowledge, it is a statement of who they are, it is a statement of their values. And sort of related to that, when you criticize someone for not believing in climate change or you contradict them, what you're really saying is, I reject who you are and I reject your values. That's effectively what you're saying. And so as we think about climate change communication, that's important to keep in mind. And we can skip over that for now. The third thing is that the human brain is hardwired not to worry about climate change. Okay, this is important as well. And there's a good paper on this by Robert Gifford, called The Dragons of Inaction, Psychological Barriers that Limit Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. And in it, he says, psychological barriers also impede behavioral choices that will facilitate mitigation, adaptation, and environmental sustainability. Although many individuals are engaged in some ameliorative action, most could do more, but they are hindered by 7 categories of psychological barriers, or dragons of inaction. And then he goes through them all. And just briefly, there are things like limited cognition. We have biases. We have ignorance. Things like ideologies. We have system justification, techno-salvation. You think that technology is going to save us. Comparisons with others, your norms, perceived inequity. Why should I have to do something when China can just pollute as much as they want? Sunk cost, behavioral momentum, discredence, mistrust, or denial. Perceived risks, the risks to changing your behavior, right? And then limited behavior, tokenism, or rebound effect. Well, shoot, I took the bus yesterday, so I'm going to go get a triple cheeseburger today. That sort of stuff. And so all of these barriers, people are really not good at seeing, hearing, or thinking about climate change, right? That's what it comes to. Basically, people discount long-term threats. And the immediate threats of climate change aren't readily apparent, are they? Because climate change is a statistical phenomenon that we observe over time. And short-term needs also take precedence, right? If you think about Maslow, the theory of human motivation, you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, And it's a good framework. There have been some reasonable criticisms of it, but it's a good thing to sort of think about, right? That is, people tend to try to take care of their physiological, their safety needs before they move on to things like social and esteem and self-actualization. Well, where on this hierarchy does long-term adaptation to climate change fit, right? Not very far when you're worried about other things. And so I think that that's worth thinking about, right? Climate change is not necessarily available for people to worry about. And that's why I say that people are hardwired not to worry about climate change. You know, people rose up looking out for predators and immediate threats and things like that, rather than just climate change or these long-term threats. So people are notoriously bad at this because that's not what we're designed to do. So knowing that we're a diverse group, I appreciate those of you who are already knew this stuff listening to me. But let's now talk about, for those of you who don't know anything about ag, 2 things that make agriculture worth studying. I knew diddly poo about ag when I started at Purdue, other than I like to eat agricultural products. And so a couple things that I think are worth contextualizing agriculture. One is agriculture is huge. I had no idea until I got to Purdue just how huge it is, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. 1% of the U.S. GDP value added comes from agriculture alone. So this puts it in one of the top handful of sectors. And the second thing that I think is really important is that agriculture emits, right? This graph here is the percentage of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and that's from electricity, transportation, industry, commercial, residential, and then agriculture. And you notice agriculture is about 8–9%, and that's pretty significant. And more significant on top of that is that United States agriculture tends to get exported to the world. And so the good practices that we're developing, we're sending to the world. And on the other side of that coin, the bad practices that we're developing, we're also exporting to the world. Because if there's one thing we're good at in this country, it's growing a whole boatload of crops. And for better or worse, we're teaching other folks to do the same. So here's our first break for questions. Have I left anybody behind? Does anybody have a question or anything? You can type it into the question box or unmute yourself and ask. All right, I will assume that that is a no. That is fine. Again, we just don't want to leave anybody behind as we're setting the stage. And now let's move in. Yeah, come back, refocus. And now let us move back in. Where were we? Yes, people are hardwired not to worry about climate change. Blame the savannah for that. But so there's this question out there: what if climate change were more personal? Right? We don't believe in climate change. We don't act in climate change because it's this distant thing that only affects people in third world countries, and I'll probably be dead, or even if I'm not dead, I can't observe it. So what if climate change were more personal? And that leads us into the study that we're going to talk about today, the effects of the 2012 Midwestern U.S. drought on climate change belief. And again, this was part of the Useful to Usable project, which I was really fortunate to work on. It's this huge USDA-funded multi-million-dollar project across a bunch of states in which we got a bunch of climatologists, crop modelers, agronomists, economists, social scientists, and RCC staff. RCC, of course, is Regional Climate Center staff, together from all these different universities to work on climate change and agriculture issues. And so this is a part of it. And we looked at stuff in the Corn Belt here, the U.S. Corn Belt, which I've got displayed right here in the Midwestern, and this is over $50 billion to the U.S. economy. So this is a real driver of what's going on here. And so what we're going to focus on today is agricultural advisors, who are key players in the corn industry. And if you're not in that area, you might not have even heard of ag advisors, but there are literally thousands of them working. For example, we asked farmers, who influences your farm decisions the most? And of the groups outside of family and friends who are the most influential, it was their chemical dealers. 70% said that they had moderate or strong influences. Seed dealers, about 65%. CCAs, which is certified crop consultants, or crop advisors, I guess, about 50%. NRCS, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and then Extension. These are all advisors. Notice Extension is actually the lowest of those in terms of influence. And there's some interesting stuff about that we won't get into, but Linda's got a paper coming out hopefully soon on that. But so advisors are really critically important in farm management decisions. And so understanding their opinions is critically important in understanding the crop system in the Midwest. And so we did a survey in 2012 of advisors. We asked them about their climate change beliefs, their risk perceptions, their attitudes towards climate adaptation, the whole spiel there. And then this drought happened in 2012, and so this was a research opportunity, right? If you don't know about the drought, there's the worst drought in 50 years, probably, maybe only 25 years, maybe forever. It just depends on what metrics you use. Crop yields were down to the lowest level since 1995, which may not sound bad, but when you consider the gains in things like crop genetics in that time, it's kind of astonishing. They were down about 25% from the estimates. Things were dry. Beef prices went way up too. So the question is, did this extreme event influence climate change beliefs, right? Did this make climate change so personal that it shifted people's opinions and attitudes? What is the role of experience? And so these are the things we asked. Now, there have been a little bit of prior work on this. Lorraine Whitmarsh studied flood victims in the UK, I believe, in a paper that was published back in 2008. 2007, 2008, and found that the flood victims differ very little from other participants in their understanding of and response to climate change. Although flood victims are more likely to feel that climate change is an issue of personal importance, they're no more knowledgeable, concerned, or active in relation to climate change than people without flooding experience. Okay, so the experience with the flood didn't seem to influence people's climate change beliefs. Let's see. And then, can you still hear me? My computer was giving me some sort of, you are experiencing network issues. Am I still there?
Stuart, yes, this is Kathy. You're still there.
Okay.
So all is well. There are a couple questions if you want to.
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay, Cornelia has a question. Cornelia, I'm going to try and unmute you. And Cornelia, what is your question?
Actually, I don't have a question. I was playing with my buttons and made a mistake.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm going to mute you again, and then Mona has a question. Hang on just a minute, Mona.
Okay, Mona.
Let's see. Mona, what is your question?
Okay, so can you hear me, Stuart?
I sure can, Mona. How are you?
Good, thanks. So basically, is this theory of cultural cognition saying that we can't critically challenge, our cultural perspectives and values in our cognition? So is that the summary?
Mona, I'm only quasi-expert in that, but I don't think that's the summary, no. I don't think it says that we cannot critically challenge people's cultural cognitions. However, I think it says that their cultural cognitions people's cultural cognitions strongly influence their risk perceptions, which is why you find wackos on either extreme, right? It's why people on the left don't get vaccines and don't eat GMO food, and people way on the right don't believe in climate change. It's because the way that people perceive facts is strongly influenced by their cognition. It doesn't mean you can't change it, but changing people's values is really challenging, right? Because that's something that is really deeply held. And so their cultural cognitions are value-based if they're not actually values. And so people's cultural cognitions are really difficult to challenge, which is why things like vaccines, it's such a pernicious problem. People who do not vaccinate their children, or it's why climate change, people who do not believe in climate change, is such a pernicious problem, because people interpret risks through their cultural cognition lenses, I think. And that's why, as you know, we've talked about, I strongly advocate for an end around in which we just skip the controversy altogether and focus on small solutions. But we'll get to that later.
So my follow-up question to you, Stuart, is what role do you see education play to address a challenge like this? Does education have a role to play? Should we stop teaching our kids facts, findings?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I used to teach 7th grade, Mona. No, I'm not saying that education has no role, and I won't get too deep into it. Maybe we can pick it up later. But education is sufficient but not necessary for things like climate change belief. And I think we should focus education on facts that people are likely to listen to, and that sort of stuff. And if folks are not likely to, you're not going to, a true believer, you're not going to educate out of their beliefs. Because of the value stuff. And so I think there are ways around that, and we'll talk about some of them later. And we might be able to take it up in more detail at the end of the webinar.
Thank you.
All right, so let's return now, and there will be more question time. But again, I much prefer to interact than to blob on, especially when I don't even know if my microphone is working, because I will just assume that you're all in raptured awe. So where were we? We were discovering that Whitmarsh found that floods did not influence people's climate change beliefs. And next up is Spence et al. And Portinga and Butler and Pigeon. This was in Nature Climate Change issue number 1. So since it was in Nature Climate Change, you know it contributes strongly to the social science. And they found that those who report experience of flooding express more concern over climate change, see it as less uncertain, and feel more confident in that their actions will have an effect on climate change. Importantly, these perceptual differences also translate into greater willingness to save energy and to mitigate climate change. Now, both the Whitmarsh and the Spence papers, which contradict each other, were based on people's past recollections, right? And then they sort of got that to jibe with their actual experience with climate change, but they contradict themselves. So what gives? Well, we were fortunate. You remember we did that 2012 survey before the big drought came. And so what this gave us was unprecedented baseline data, right? We were able to do a natural experiment on the agricultural advisors there and survey them before the flood and then after the flood. And this had never been done before, so this adds a little bit of rigor onto the prior studies here. And so we asked all the same questions, and then we also asked about their experience with the drought. And so I think this was a really critical thing to do. And so I was really happy to be part of it. It was not my brilliant idea. They hired me to do it after they had the brilliant idea. So again, credit to the co-authors. So we had 3 hypotheses based on the social amplification of risk framework and also the reason action approach, which you may know as planned behavior, or reason action, I suppose. First was that belief in climate change will have increased. Okay, after the drought, belief in climate change will have increased. The second is that risk perceptions will have increased. Climate-related risk perceptions will have gone up. And the third is that willingness to use climate information or willingness to adapt will have increased. Attitudes toward adaptation, actually, is a better way to phrase that. That's how I meant to phrase it, will have increased. So let's look at the survey. We administered it electronically to about 7,500 agricultural advisors. I told you that there were a bunch of these. And we got about a 25% response rate, which is roughly equivalent to what they had in 2012. And there were 864 repeat respondents. So these were the basis of our comparison, right? So we could do pre and post. We didn't have a control group because it was a natural experiment, or maybe a natural quasi-experiment. I don't know. Ask your methods class teacher. But regardless, we had 864 repeat respondents to compare. And we administered it in Indiana, Nebraska, Michigan, and Iowa. And as a former resident, I can tell you that this is Indiana. That's Nebraska. There's Michigan, like the hand, and then Iowa is right there. This is a strange projection with warped states. So again, there we go. We hypothesized that belief in climate change will have increased, risk perceptions associated with climate change will have increased, and attitudes towards climate change adaptation will have become more favorable. Okay, those were our hypotheses. Now we're going to take them one at a time. And so focusing on that first one, did climate change belief increase? We asked a question with a couple of options here. Climate change is occurring, and it is mostly caused by natural changes in the environment. Climate change is occurring, and it is caused mostly by human activities. Climate change is occurring, and it is caused equally by natural changes in the environment and human activities. Climate change is not occurring, and there is not sufficient evidence to know with certainty whether or not climate change is occurring. Okay, and so we asked this question, asked people to choose, because this covered in one question the gamut about their climate change beliefs and also their beliefs on the anthropogenic nature of climate change. And we got this question, I believe, from the Iowa Farm Poll. And then we also binned these questions together, these responses together into people who believe in climate change and people who do not, just to compare those without looking at the causality issue. So the first thing is belief in climate change. On the left we have pre, on the right we have post. About 73% of people difference here. Most of these people already believed in some form in climate change, and that didn't shift. But let's look at sort of within that question, let's look at the different responses. And so here's pre-drought. About 35% of people thought it was kind of equally human and equally natural.
Stuart,
about 26% thought it was not sufficient.
Stuart,
Yeah.
This is Kathy. Sorry, you just
Hey.
on that last slide there was some interference. Can you go back one slide and repeat?
Okay,
Thank you.
sure, maybe. Oh no, I'm sliding out. Here?
Yeah, that one.
Okay, no change in climate change belief year over year. That's the gist here, right? Here we are 72.8 before and 73.6 after. There's just no difference year over year. And this is in, generically, do you believe in climate change? Yes or no. Now, next, we're going to split that out into a couple of different things. Pre-drought, about 35% of people thought climate change was occurring and it was equally human and natural. About 26% thought there was insufficient evidence, and about 26% thought it was occurring and naturally caused. And then only a few people thought it was occurring and mostly human caused, and very few people thought it wasn't occurring. And in all honesty, these didn't shift a lot post-drought, right? The only one that really changed, none of these changed all that significantly after the drought. There just was not a big shift in climate change beliefs. And so we also measured how bad the drought was in terms of a cumulative drought index. So we looked at people's actual experience with the drought to see whether or not they, whether or not that influenced their climate change beliefs. And so this is the median here of the cumulative drought index. And here are all the different people. Each dot represents a person. And this is how bad their experience was with the drought, right? So these two dots here, or I guess circles, had really bad drought experience. These few over here had less drought experience. And so now I'm going to overlay in orange the people who changed their mind about climate change, okay? And if the drought was having a big effect, we would expect most of them to probably be over here, right? Or we might expect what they would call in the medical literature a dosage effect, in which there are a few people here, a little more here, and a bunch over there. And so now I'm going to put up all, 20 people or so who changed. And let's see. Right as you see, they're basically spread all over the place. There's no evidence of a dosage effect. Here's everybody who changed their mind about climate change, went from not believing to believing, and there's just no difference. So we hypothesized that belief in climate change will have increased after the drought, and it turns out it did not increase after the drought. The drought seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Let's look at the second hypothesis, that risk perceptions associated with climate change will have increased after the drought. And so what we did here was we asked about a series of risk perceptions, including floods and rain and ponding, nutrient runoff, these are all farm specific obviously, and drought and heat and weeds and insects and disease. And factor analysis showed that these could be split into kind of three groups. One that we call wet risks, which are risks from too much water. 2, dry risks, which are risks from not enough water, and 3, nuisance risks, which are risks from things like pests and weeds and insects, so things that are nuisances to the crops. And so here are results here in terms of risk perceptions. Now these bean plots are a way of sort of representing this all at once. They represent kernel density estimates of the mean. And so the dark gray here is pre-drought, the light gray there is post-drought, and these orange lines are the average. And each one of these is an individual data point. So the darker and thicker it is, the more data points that are around there. And the stars represent significant differences. So after the drought, the overall, if you just look at the average of risk perceptions, did not change. But the wet risk perceptions, worries from too much water, decreased fairly significantly after the drought. After the drought, the dry risk perceptions, or worries about too little water, increased a fair amount as well. And the nuisance risk perceptions also increased. So there were changes in risk perception, but not overall. It was actually sort of all these minor issues there. And it looks like someone might have a question, so I can take a break now in advance of my other break, but you'll miss out on a hilarious joke slide. But that's your own loss. Yes?
Okay, this question is from Vikram. So, Vikram, you're unmuted.
Hello?
Hello?
So are you able to hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I just had a question about the educational background of the participants, the advisors.
Mm-hmm.
So could you please tell me what that was?
Yeah, it's extremely high. Basically all college graduates, many with graduate degrees. And so the question then is, can we generalize to the population if this is a population of elites? And when we say elites, we mean that in terms of education. It's not a value judgment. It's a term of art. And the answer is that's a legitimate question about these data in terms of generalizing to the public. But I still think that it's an interesting finding regardless of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But absolutely, it is an elite population, and that is one thing to say. But we're talking about psychological processes, and I don't know for a fact that the education will influence, the effects of these droughts. It very well may. It very well may not, though. I don't think we can assume one or the other either way. So if we should get a lot of funding and study it separately. If anybody has a lot of funding, give me a call. Nope, are you there? Yeah, sorry. So anyway, so perceptions change, but man, in a funny way. Look at this. So after the drought, and this is why they pay me the big money, people were less worried about water, more worried about not enough water. Okay, this is the big finding here, right? So I don't know that that's climate change related at all. To me, it looks very specific to the instance of having a drought, right? Not all of a sudden people were way more worried about anything related to climate change, but people were way more worried about drought-specific risks. And so I think that there's a good argument to be made that that's what's happening there, rather than a greater climate change worry, especially because climate change belief didn't increase, that people were just more worried about what happens when you have a drought. So now looking at, again, we're looking for that dosage effect. You would expect it to be, this is a fitting line, looking at the change in perception versus the drought index. You would expect a lower left to upper right regression line there if there were some sort of dosage effect. There's a little bit one there in the dry risk perception, and it's basically flat in nuisance risk. So I don't think that we can really say that definitely the risk perceptions associated with climate change will have increased. The risk perception shifted, but it wasn't always up, and I don't know that you can argue that it's because of climate change or it's climate change related. So this last hypothesis, attitudes towards climate change adaptation will have become more favorable. So people will be more predisposed to adapt to climate change. And this is where the rubber hits the road, right? If you're doing outreach, this is what you want to know. Are people more likely to want to adapt? And so we'll look at these bean plots individually. Average adaptation attitude, this is not a significant difference. The dark gray is before, the light gray is after. Basically no difference. I would like to provide advice based on climate forecasts. Again, virtually no difference here, right? Virtually no difference. Farmers should take additional steps to protect farmland from increased weather variability. Here we do see a significant difference. And it's interesting that the one where we see the difference is saying something farmers should do, not I should do. That might tell you something about the way the people act, right? And in my role as advisor, I should help farmers prepare for increased weather variability. No difference there. And I think finally, changing practices to cope with increasing climate variability is important to the long-term success of the farmers I advise. And that might as well be a mirror image of itself. And maybe finally, for real, it is important for farmers to adapt to climate change to ensure the long-term success of U.S. agriculture. No difference there. And so hypothesis 3, that attitudes towards climate change adaptation will have become more favorable. Also, we reject that. They did not change. Attitudes towards adaptation did not change. And this is kind of a bummer. So this was our next question break, but I think we got in that question. Does anybody have one? Chime in quickly, or if not, we'll move on.
Dennis Toddy has a comment. Dennis, I'll unmute you.
Oh, Dennis. All right, Dennis also worked on this project. He's the climatologist at South Dakota State. Is that right, Dennis?
Correct. I'm the state climatologist in South Dakota. Yeah, and the comment is, we talked about this, I think, sometime during our conversations, that the farm community has a tendency to be more concerned about what has happened. The phrase commonly used is, we're farming last year. What happened last year is what I'm most concerned about this coming year, even though the risk of that happening again is somewhat lower. So I think that's reflected in the data that you saw there.
Thanks, Dennis. I do appreciate it.
We also have a
Okay,
question from Anthony.
Oh yeah, thank you. I typed it in the chat box there. Just wondering if you have any information how one's age would influence climate change perception. Thank you.
Anthony, I do, but I don't have those data on top of me. In some of the regressions we did look at age, and it was not a significant influence. But generally speaking, the older you are, the less likely you are to believe in climate change. But I can't remember how it looks at this population specifically. If we have time at the end, I might be able to look that up for you. Thanks. Okay, and to Dennis's point, I think that's a really great point. And one thing I want to sell you on, if you're a social scientist, is part of this U2U project was we did all this quantitative work, and we did a whole boatload of qualitative work as well. And I spent my prior life as a fisheries biologist, and so qualitative work gave me the heebie-jeebies before I went to get my PhD in human dimension stuff, and I think that it added a lot to our understanding of this system. And so I'm a huge proponent of adding qualitative work onto your quantitative work, not just sort of as before you do the survey, go to a focus group to find out, but also, really important understanding. I have a much better understanding of the system because of the qualitative work we did. And Dennis, of course, does work with stakeholders all the time, so he has that innate. But for bozos like me, the ability to pick it up was critical. So do your qualitative work too. It's hard because you have to actually talk to people, which nobody wants to do, but it's worth it in the long run. All right, so to recap or recapitulate, if you will, belief in climate change did not change. Risk perceptions shifted but did not change, and attitudes towards climate change adaptation also did not change. And this last one here is really kind of a bummer. And the reason it's a bummer is because this is where that rubber hits the road, right? And so this is what's important. And the reason it's important is I like to think of this framework, the reason action model. Oh my gosh, Fishbein's name got cut off. So here's a picture of Eisen here, and also Martin Fishbein did this work on the reasoned action model. And I only have Eisen's picture because he has an active website where he talks about it. So I guess the moral is don't die before your co-authors, or if you do, at least leave a good website. And so this is, to me, one of the most important and well-tested behavior theories that there is. And this is why the fact that attitudes didn't change is a bummer. Let's go through it piece by piece, and we'll try to understand. So first of all, we want to try and understand why people do something, why they behave in a certain way, why do they choose an action or not. And behavior in the reasoned action model, which you may know as the theory of planned behavior or the theory of reasoned action, it's undergone a few shifts. Behavior means they call it a reasoned behavior, but really almost anything that you do can be considered a behavior. And the most reliable predictor of a behavior is what we call the behavioral intention. And that means that you intend to do something. Now, this may be microseconds before you actually do it, or it may be long term. And so what I talk about a lot is, say, riding my bike to work. Before I go to ride my bike to work, I intend to do it. So I have to, go and get my bike and everything. And your intention is influenced by a few things. The first is your attitudes towards the behavior. And there are some other things that go into this that I'm leaving off, so this is a simplification. But basically, if I think that this is a positive thing, if I have generally favorable attitudes, I'm more likely to do a behavior than if I have negative attitudes. So I know that if I ride my bike to work, I will become extremely healthy and fit, even better looking, and women and men will fall all over me, and I will save the planet by emitting less carbon. So I have very favorable attitudes, but I have some negative attitudes too, like I will arrive at work looking and smelling like a swamp. So these fight with each other, right? Then there's a subjective norm, which is the social pressures you feel to do or not do a certain behavior. So when I worked at the Natural Resources Social Science Lab, everybody rode their bike, even in the terrible weather that they have in West Lafayette. So I felt a lot of pressure to ride my bike. Here in Texas, I don't think anybody owns a bike. Instead, I feel pressure to buy a pickup truck. That's what the subjective norm is here. Fortunately, I still have those old reference back in West Lafayette keeping me from purchasing a pickup truck. And then finally, perceived behavioral control. That is, do you know how to do something? Do you feel like you can do it? And these are the things that influence whether or not you do certain behavior. And if I were Malcolm Gladwell or somebody trying to get rich off a popular press book, I would call these the 3 levers of behavior change, right? And so if you can pull on any of these levers, you can influence people's behavioral intentions and then their actual behaviors. And also in there is actual behavioral control, whether or not you can actually do anything about it. And so, unfortunately, we, first of all, do these count? Like, do these work on people's desire to use climate information? So we did a quick regression looking at perceived behavioral control and attitudes and norms, right? Whether or not these influenced whether or not people wanted to use climate information. So did they want to use climate information to adapt to climate change? And we used attitudes, perceived behavioral controls, norms, education, and gender. And here are the significant predictors here. And we found, look at this, these reasoned action things did significantly predict whether or not people wanted to use climate information. Okay? So attitudes were important. Perceived behavioral controls was important. Perceived norms were important. Education was important. Being female or male was also important, incidentally. And but those attitudes are critical. And so this is why things were a bummer, right? This is why the fact that they were predicted is why it was a real bummer, that attitudes did not improve. We don't get a free pull at that lever. And that's what, the hope is that if people's attitudes change, we get a free pull at the attitude lever because it makes it easier. Unfortunately, that's not what occurred. Now, looking at this study, there are a few reasonable critiques and complaints and a few unreasonable ones as too, and some folks have already chimed in with some of those, but let's point them out and think about them for a minute. One is this is a population of relative elites. These are people who went to college, who have jobs, and who are well educated, and so that is potentially one complaint. We can't necessarily generalize this to the whole population. Although again, I would say that we can't necessarily not generalize it to the whole population either. We just don't know. Second, this is a population that is used to dealing with weather cycles, and you know, farmers, they work with the earth, right? Ag advisors work with the earth. They're used to dealing cyclically with things. They've had droughts before, they'll have droughts again. They do look to the past in these situations. And this is a population that is buffered from the effects of drought by crop insurance. Here's the big unknown, right? The drought was the worst drought in forever, and almost nobody lost any money thanks to crop insurance. So that may buffer the effects. It also may not, but that's something we just can't control for and just don't have a good answer to. And the drought was only 1 year. We have longer droughts going on, like in California. So maybe some of this would change over time, right? Maybe in California, where everybody probably believes in climate change anyway, but maybe these longer droughts have a more gradual effect. And so that is a fair point. But to all that, I would say, remember, this is something that's not been done before. We had the pre-data and the post-data, and so that's a strength of this study that I think is you shouldn't undersell. Because we're able to see these changes, you know, right away, rather than asking somebody about their experience with flood years before, or rather than indirectly looking at this, we were able to directly say, here's how bad people's flood experience was, and here's how it influenced or didn't influence. And so I think that's critically important and a really great thing about this study. So the conclusion then, what are the effects of extreme events on perceptions of climate change, right? Because there's this idea that, you know, maybe one big storm like Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, maybe there might be some sort of silver bullet, right, that will suddenly cause people to become good people and believe in climate change and worry about the future and all of this. Maybe the drought will do it. And it looks like maybe not, right? Extreme events may not change people's views on climate change. You know, but maybe there's an opportunity for framing around risk perceptions. Think back to the fact that climate change is part of people's identity, not a part of their knowledge. So maybe we do focus on things that people are more worried about that are climate related. And this is what I argue all the time when talking about this. Don't focus on the controversy, focus on what we can do. And UTU is doing a good job about that. I'm focusing on helping people adapt to climate and weather variability rather than worrying about climate change, the controversy. Don't talk about the identity, talk about the real world personal stuff. Because people don't want to hear things, and people don't want to deal with climate. And so you want to make sure that your information is useful and usable, right? Frame this stuff in a way that is useful to people and is usable to people. And that really is the biggest message. And I think the biggest message of the Useful to Usable project is you really got to know your audience, and you really got to understand what are their push points, right? And if there is a controversy about climate change, then don't focus on that controversy and don't wait for some external force to change it, because it very well may not happen. Instead, focus on the real, focus on the local, focus on the personal, focus on the non-controversial, and in doing that, you can start to make some differences, I think. And so from there, we will take any other questions you might have, and thank you very much.
So if anyone has a question, you can type your name in the chat box or the question box, and I will unmute you. Okay. There's a thank you from Mona.
Oh, you're welcome, Mona. Well, so I really appreciate everybody attending, and if you do have questions, please just hit me up at this email address. Again, I'm in Texas Sea Grant now, or if it's more about the agriculture and the UTU stuff specifically, just go to agclimateforyou.org, and you can get in touch with Linda as the director. She was my postdoc advisor at Purdue, and I think you can find contact information for people at all 58 UTU-related universities, or however many there were, and look at some of the really great work they're doing in developing decision support tools, various outreach products, and a lot of really great science that's being done as well. So it's a lot of good work. I was really proud to be a part of it and go along for the ride, I think, on the back of some really good people. There was a different question thing that I didn't use, so I threw in a picture of my daughter instead. So we'll go back to that, and there we go. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll send the recording and information about the presentation to the attendee list. Thanks.